Welcome to How Hard Can It Be, the podcast where we explore AI one question at a time.
Hey, welcome back to How Hard Can It Be, the show where we explore AI one question at a time. Today's guest is Dr. Chris Bronk, Associate Professor at the University of Houston Hobby School of Public Affairs and Associate Director of its Center for Information Security Research and Education. Former U.S. Foreign Service Officer and Senior State Department Advisor, Chris is the author of Cyber Threat, the Rise of Information Geopolitics in U.S. National Security. He's a Fulbright Distinguished Chair specializing in cyber geopolitics, critical infrastructure, and hybrid warfare. He's doing a lot of great research, supported by NSF, DHS, DOE, Deloitte, Microsoft, and other well-known names. So we're really excited of having you here today, Chris. Welcome to the show.
Thank you very much for having me.
So, hey, let's dive right into it. You moved kind of from diplomat to cybersecurity leader, across your career from public service more to academia, focused topics. So how has this journey from diplomacy to cybersecurity happened? I would be really keen to learn of that.
Well, it started with cybersecurity first, and I didn't mean to. I was a developer for a startup that got acquired in the 90s. And I took an interest when we got a big envelope in the mail from the U.S. back to the U.S. consulate in Hong Kong when it was still a British colony, dominion, whatever they called it. And basically, we got all of our software pirated in Asia, and then watched our Asian market collapse pretty much within a year. And this was coinciding with like the Asian financial crisis of 1998. And so I became very interested in cybersecurity stuff. And really it was, and I did a PhD on policy issues in cyber, but really what drove it more than anything, the move to diplomacy was, the State Department said they wanted to do more stuff with IT, with information. Colin Powell had just become Secretary of State, and his son was, I think, one of the senior execs at AOL. And they said, we're going to bring the internet to American diplomacy. And I took the test, I passed, and they hired me. So I did it. And so it actually isn't as, in hindsight, it seems maybe a bit of a crazy transition. But now I think, as we have so many international meetings and delegations on AI issues that, I think interact with cyber pretty well. It all kind of fell into place. It didn't seem like it at the time. It seemed like a pretty wacky thing to do. And then the other driver was I got selected for working at the State Department right after 9/11 and had never done any national service and wanted to do some, and figured this was about as good as any avenue for using my wits to do public service. So I know it sounds like kind of a unusual pattern, but as I've explained to others, it really started when I was an undergraduate at the University of Wisconsin and majored in history, but got a minor in math. So, and that's because I was an engineering school dropout, basically.
Well, thanks for sharing. And look, it makes sense, right? And you also have to say, when all of this was established back then, to your point where it wasn't really obvious why these two things fit together, it speaks of great foresight in sense of how critical and important the topic has become and is today, in particular in context of AI now.
Yeah, I mean, I never thought that I was blazing a path or anything like that. I just was curious and thought these things were interesting. So when everyone else was studying peacekeeping or whatever in the policy world, I wanted to look at international information things and cyber. And now those are real areas that have grown up because of computation, information technologies, networking, all of that. I think it's a fabulous accident for me that it worked out well. But in the early days, it did not seem like the best of ideas.
Makes sense. So I think you coined the phrase information geopolitics. So how should we look at that in context of nation state actors, for example, targeting corporate networks or corporate entities? Because, if and I probably have a lot of memory holes here, but if I think back, I don't remember a real instance where a nation state has publicly used information or cyber as a public deterrent or admitting to it, right? I would say it's still a pretty covert, non-public, you know, instrument, for lack of a better word. So how does politics fit together with cyber and information in that context? Does the question make sense?
Sure, it makes a lot of sense. So I think that it's been an evolution, obviously, but um, I think with the idea that data or computational companies are the new kind of major players in markets. This whole idea that data is the new oil, which sitting in Houston, Texas, I think oil is still oil. Um, but basically, so much international activity has come to depend on computation. So we see deals cut all the time between countries on access to certain kinds of processing or computational tooling or other things. So like, the Dutch lithography company ASML doesn't, export their products to certain countries, but does to others. So I think this has been a long time coming. And I think that the moment that I said, aha, I think this is really changing is when companies like Facebook or Google or even Microsoft really started wading into the international politics of what they did. And you now have Microsoft that is putting out reports on both kind of propaganda operations, digital propaganda, I think is what my friend Matt Chesson calls it. And you have cyber being used not against just government targets, but all sorts of industrial or even civil society targets. So, things like the Chinese going after Falun Gong organization people and trying to get access to their data. That was one of the kind of geopolitical cases that kind of rose up about 15 years ago, almost 20 years ago. So I think there's a good record now of where we see this. And it's suddenly become very important. And I think really where we are now, and not just with cyber, but with computation in general, is, we're seeing computation as an arms race, especially with regard to AI, in the same way that we maybe saw space exploration, getting to the moon, and even, winning medals at the Olympics during the Cold War days, which is back now with China, who gets the most medals and who's the best country at that. So geopolitics picks out a lot of different venues that are pretty interesting that you wouldn't anticipate. But as economic activity is so tied to computation today, of course, there are going to be political interests across international boundaries that have differing opinions. And that's where you get into those geopolitical fissures and struggles.
Yeah, that makes perfect sense. So, if I'm a CISO of any company for that matter, and there's a scenario where attacking my corporation, my infrastructure might have a political motivation background incentive. Are there any particular frameworks that CISOs can look at or should look at? And I don't mean framework in sense of, your cybersecurity posture framework, but in particular, getting entangled, for lack of a better word, in a geopolitical event where a security playbook of different nature has to be applied.
So a colleague of mine, Nate Jones, we wrote a little case study paper on, hey, what are the variables that you would want to think about when you have a geopolitical cyber incident? So I wrote a case study, I think in 2012, on when Saudi Aramco got hacked, ostensibly by the Iranians, but possibly by others, including assistance maybe from Russia. And so the reality is that firms, they have international capabilities to exert their interests and to, develop their business more widely. But, this is an area of governments traditionally. What's different now is the kind of proliferation of targeting
Mhm.
that an NGO can be targeted because it backs the Dalai Lama, say, or a corporation does business in a way that the anonymous hacking group finds objectionable, so they go after them. And that's not as big now as it was, say, 10, 15 years ago, but it's still out there. And then nation states go after each other using, the cyber vector a great deal, and that's espionage. And I'm not one of those people who clutches their pearls when I hear that someone has spied on someone else. It's very natural. I think espionage is just part of the world we live in, both economically and politically. Um, and I don't think that's going to change. And it's just that organizations now are so unaware of the world they live in with regard to cyber threats, with regard to competition they don't even know about. And we find companies just getting nailed because they were just unaware. And then there's also the criminality aspect that, I think I had to do an interview a couple of years ago where a large dental practice got hit with a ransomware attack. And basically, they're like, well, why us? Why are we, what do we do wrong? And it's not
Yep.
why us. It's it's that old line, why do you rob banks? It's where the money is. Well, the money
Yep.
now is in,
Opportunistic.
yeah,
Yep.
exactly.
No, perfect. So let's get to the to the elephant in the room, agentic AI. In other episodes and generally in conversations, we always try to look back. I've been in tech now for over 20 years. What did we learn from the internet and how long it took to have cybersecurity as a mandatory practice in place, right? What did we learn from social media and how long did it take between I always call it the techno euphoria, right? From techno euphoria to
Yeah.
understanding the adversarial effects. So I have to say, based on our observations, it's not much different, right? There is maximum power on techno euphoria. And slowly we start pushing and stepping in with safety, security, compliance, governance, and so on and so forth. But given the speed, how fast AI is moving, I wonder if we even have a chance to catch up and if there's a tipping point, right, where things get out of control, because I see so many companies aggressively rolling out agentic workflows. So let's talk about, if you don't mind, first,
No.
in principle of lessons not learned to some degree, and how this is different from social media unfolding or cyber. And then part two to the question is, what does it mean from an attack surface point of view?
Let me park attack surface in my notes and so I don't miss it. Years ago, Leonard Kleinrock, who was, at the initial ARPANET lab in Southern California, communicating, with the Stanford folks, um, said, we kept missing these security events as the internet developed from 1969 forward. And he said, these were the aha moments we had, but we just wanted the thing to work. We just wanted the internet to function. And, and Len basically said, we should have seen the yellow cards. We should have seen those kind of flashing warning lights, but we were just really determined to make internet functionality a thing. And when you blow it open in the early 1990s, from, a small number of hosts to millions overnight, all of these concerns, and he said, we should have really taken the Morris worm in 1988, 89 more seriously, but we didn't because we just wanted it to work. And I think that's very much the metaphor that I think carries or the kind of aphorism that carries the AI piece is, well, we just want it to work. We want
Yep.
it to work better. And by the time we get it to work the way we think we want it to work, we're going to see probably a whole set of externalities, these kind of unforeseen other outcomes that we didn't really plan on, that maybe some people said, but then, the herd around the issue said, you know what, this is what we want. We're going there. This is a minor problem. We'll solve it later. And, that's been the story of security for, 3 decades now.
Yep.
So I think that, basically we're very bad at forecasting the negative things in general because they aren't tied to our positive aspirations. This is very much part of the human condition in general. So, I don't see that's going to change with AI. And I raise all sorts of issues on the garbage in, garbage out problem of training data and curating training data, in a better way. But the steamroller's rolling forward, and we're not going to stop it. With regard to an attack surface, with each new release, GPT-5 is banging around. It did a really lousy job of writing my bio, which is a trick I learned from my friend Moshe Vardi, who's a longtime computer scientist. He has every new version of AI do his bio, and the new versions always blow it in really interesting ways.
Right.
And it's funny because GPT-4 now will write a really good bio for me, probably as good as I can write myself at this point. But GPT-5 was immediately saying it actually conflated some things that I do with my partner, which I thought was really weird. Things she's up to because we've been doing some writing together online on a blog. And, I found that really interesting that it's suddenly like, oh, I have an interest in social work. No, I mean, I think it's good, but no, I don't. With DeepSeek, and I think I had access to DeepSeek 2 days while I was in Australia before my Australian university politely said, don't connect to that from here.
Yeah.
Um, but, DeepSeek also just didn't do a very good job in its early iteration. And yes, it improves, but with each of these kind of generational or evolutionary steps of development, we see, things that slide backwards and then improvements. I come from knowing all this by starting off with, Bayesian methods and Markov chains, 20 years ago, because that was the way to sift and sort data that seemed like a good idea. And it gave us some capabilities, and decision trees were useful. And we'll look at those notional networks or neural network kind of diagrams and say, oh, it'd be really nice. And now we're there. Well, how are the neurons working on that data? Because I
Yeah.
know, that I do a lot of cognitive shortcutting. And most of the time it doesn't matter that much, but sometimes it matters a lot. And the cognitive shortcuts I see, for lack of a better word, agentic or AGI intelligence, whatever that is, when it comes doing. I mean, human beings make mistakes with information, so it's unreasonable to think that computational systems built by human beings will be any better.
Well, I think it goes even further than that, right? So if you listen to the horror stories of, well, when GPT or Claude was threatened to be turned off, it sent emails to competitors and did all kind of nasty stuff, right? And it tricks you into the belief that it's a sentient being, right? That it basically has self-governance to some control. And I think that's one of the hardest things for people to grasp, that behavior in this case is not equal being sentient. Because to your point, garbage in, we just trained it on, all the digital output and more that we as humans have produced. So it's emulating behavior, but not necessarily independently, autonomously showing behavior, if that makes sense.
But there is a behavior there that's programmed in a way.
Yes, exactly. Yeah.
Yeah, and I find it fascinating.
Right.
I was quizzing GPT on something. I was looking at just quick off the cuff research question on, Russian exports into Asia, including arms exports. And GPT made a mistake, and I detected it, and I say, no, the Japanese don't do that. And it has this very obsequious kind of apologetic tone that it takes up where, oh, what I really meant to say. And it kind of reminds me like when you catch a kid, in a fib. And it's like, well, what I really was saying is I'm going to stay at my friend's house and I'm going to do. So there's that it one of the most frustrating things that I've noticed is, AI programming that can't be wrong and can't take a hint, or can't be refuted. It has to go to some other truth without accepting, the untruth or the incorrect. And so I find that very interesting. And it happens because, you know, synthesizing an idea, and setting aside disinformation and fake news and all
Mhm.
these other ideas that are floating around, setting aside what actually happened, what is the thing? And then this idea that human beings have all this experience. We gain knowledge. I can't imagine how many books I've read in a lifetime, or TV programs I've watched that were instructional to me, or whatever. But basically, this idea that a machine is going to be as bright, as me. Okay, that's okay. But that experience component, that you know I was explaining today something that I learned adjudicating visas 25 years ago or 20 years ago that is relevant to immigration now in the US. It's my experience. My colleague Carolyn Semler, she's a psychologist at the University of Adelaide, where I just wrapped up my fellowship. We sat down one day and I don't think that we're going to get to general intelligence just from this pathway of more data and more cranks at the wheel gets us there. I don't think that training that we do as experts, whether it's business experts who have MBAs or PhDs who teach college or computer scientists who have degrees in logic or coding or whatever, um, the idea that the machine is going to have the intuition and is going to have the capacity to make the cognitive shortcuts that we make every day. And I
Especially
take
to
an
such, very fine-grained contextual nuances, for example, right?
Yeah,
Yeah.
and that I think that's something that we're still learning about. Could it be, replicated? There are times, I'm a big science fiction buff, and I gave a talk on science fiction and its relevance to cyber and info issues a couple months ago, which was a really fun talk to give. Whenever I get to talk about Isaac Asimov or something like that, the canonical kind of science
Yeah.
fiction writers, you know, and I think, well, I think that's very relevant to this discussion. Serious people might say, "Oh, that's crazy. How could science fiction have anything to do with the internet age we live in?" And it's like, well, don't you know what we all read and watch and know, and that if you don't know certain things, you will be laughed out of
It's a
rooms with computer
self-fulfilling
scientists.
prophecy, so to some degree. Yeah.
Yeah. So, but really, I mean, it's that imaginative component. And in cyber, getting a leg up in cybersecurity generally is about having the imagination to think about what the bad guy might want to do. And if you can have a pretty good command of that, you're ahead of the game. But
Right.
if you're fully reactive, you're doomed.
Yeah. Want to still cover the human in the loop aspect. So just kind of building a bridge from our last question. So if we accept that an LLM is trained on the good and the bad stuff, right? And if we acknowledge that the problem is if you try to train it only on good behavior, who is the arbitrator and who decides what good behavior is, right? This is where the problem already starts, right? But if we accept that, okay, an LLM has great utility, but it is potentially equally flawed, like the behavior it emulates that it learned from all its data, to your point.
Mhm.
So now that we utilize the LLMs to instruct agents, right, things will work out great, but they will also work out not so great, because these are the same models and the same behaviors that could pop up from either hallucination or weird incentivization of the model. So the human in the loop, right? So a lot of clients that we work with, almost all agentic workflows have a human in the loop.
Mhm.
It is either there temporarily until there's enough confidence so that the human in the loop can be taken out, or the process is designed for the human in the loop to be a permanent component of that flow. So
Mhm.
how should we look at human in the loop from a cybersecurity perspective? Maybe even, and maybe that's a stretch, trying to tie the bow onto information geopolitics. Where are agents where we cannot remove the human in the loop anytime soon? Let's put it like
Y-
that.
Yeah. So working with defense and security professionals, the idea that lethal force could be used is always thrown around. And I just saw today an article came up on my reading list on AI's role in nuclear deterrence.
Hmm.
And that's the kind of topic where, I mean, yes, I get it. I get that they want to apply this new technology to the fundamental aspect of geopolitical security that we live with, but it scares me to a great extent. I mean, I was going to say a swear, but I won't. But I still remember that scene in the War Games movie with Matthew Broderick from the early '80s,
Yeah.
where you've got two actors in a Minuteman missile silo, and one of them's not willing to pull the trigger. And I've shown that in class, and I say, well, do we want the computer to take over if the person doesn't do the job? And the simple answer for me is no. Um, Now, I've heard all sorts of things about human in the loop. I've heard human in the loop slows things down, that it retards computer learning, that human bias is actually an impediment to better AI systems. And then I've heard very kind of enthusiastic thinking. People who say subject matter expertise is a supercharger for
Mm.
AI systems. And this idea that human beings have to run with the machine somehow, I understand. Now, what concerns me is when the human in the loop becomes um, inured or kind of withdraws from their engagement to a degree. So I'm very concerned in cybersecurity that we have these AI systems rolling out that are trying to help. So what my students who graduated with cyber degrees have told me year after year is we are overwhelmed in the security operations center environment because there's just so much data and we
Right.
can't get through it all. And it's a river going by. And if we can flag the most important things as it goes by, and these are massive corporations with enormous resources, top 50, global corporations, and they're saying we can't even do this. We can find things we want to protect and we can be pretty good at that, but the data flow is just so high. So with AI, the promise is, okay, well, it's gonna take this fire hose down and make it, something that we can actually absorb. But the question is, how do we trust it? Another thing a colleague of mine mentioned is this idea of an ecosystem in which all of this functions. And what's a healthy ecosystem? My colleague Keith Ransom, came to me a few months ago and said, what actually would be good? So I don't think we even have that down yet, where we say, what are the, without citing Asimov again and talking about robots, what are those core principles? And we see responsible AI, and my concern is I talk to way too many policy people where I don't think they understand what they're talking about.
Yeah. I mean, I think that's a podcast on its own, an episode on its own, is the increasing gap between the legislators' understanding of emerging technology and the pace of which it's moving. I mean, you saw this with the first Zuckerberg Facebook hearing, and I think it just got worse. And this might also be almost a responsibility of corporations to put more into awareness, understanding, and training, and so on and so forth.
Yeah. I
Um,
mean, these are learnable skills. You can teach people how the machine works.
right.
It's not a complete black box. I feel I'm lucky because at every phase of machine learning, I found a project and worked on it and grew in some way. I don't think my understanding would be the same if I was coming up now, if I hadn't learned how to mess with screwy Perl code in the 1990s without a debugger.
Yep.
So there's this process that, and I don't want to say that we old timers, except maybe the COBOL guys or whatever, are the answer. But this idea of, well, the machine used to be able to do this, but now it drives my kid around Austin and she prefers it to a human driven car because the negative externalities of a human being driving, like they might be a jerk or abusive or worse.
Yep.
The machine, it doesn't have any of those motivations. It's doing what it's told until it is overwhelmed by a question or a scenario or a situation that it winds up in.
And to your point, because just because it's an older technology doesn't mean it doesn't have value or utility. So at AIsberg, we are very adamant about, well, you shouldn't use the same technology to monitor the technology you're seeking safety and security for. That's that should be obvious, not to monitor a black box with a black box. So
Right.
we heavily lean on machine learning that's explainable, and even though it can't do all the tricks of an LLM, it's purpose built and has one specific focus and specialization, which is to basically watch the other AI, which is moving ahead of, or ahead
Uh-huh.
from our normal comprehension at a very fast pace.
Yeah, and it's hard to predict.
Exactly. Yeah. Yeah. This was great, Chris. I really appreciate the chat.
Sure.
Is there anything else you think we should have touched on that I didn't ask, but that would make sense to round it up?
I think that the thing that I'm finding now very interesting, is on the human side.
Mm-hmm.
So one is essentially, what is the role of people? This is the first technology that's really come after the highly skilled or professional jobs. And what are governments, corporations, major entities going to do about it? And will there be regulation? Will there be actors out there who want to change the game slightly? So I think that we are right now in what I guess Gartner would call the peak of the hype cycle.
If the hype cycle, yeah.
And there will be a trough at some point. And, I think that we need to be thinking about what the signals are in that trough and on the way down. And I think there will be a way down. I don't know when it'll happen or how or why, but I think it will. It's just, they've been proven right again and again. And then what is the reasonable discussion to have on, look, we made cars a lot safer. We've done all sorts of things, to automate the heck out of processes where human beings make mistakes or just do bad things. But, we have a lot less experience with this. And I think the industry needs to be prepared not to say, we're going to solve all your problems. We're going to make your life better. Yeah. I think it has to be a much more frank discussion on, where things are headed. I think the final thing, is just, like anything else in computing, this is having enormous interest now. Where will it be in 5 years? I have some ideas, but I think that the industry needs to think a lot more about the public interest. Mm-hmm. And that means efficacy. So it's not just efficiency anymore. It has to be efficacy, resilience, all these other ideas that have to play in.
And social impact, or social impact in sense of the Chinese, with a very central, obviously, government structure, they switch off all AI during exam week, right? Because they understood that they will not create effective white collar workers and researchers if they allow the next 2 generations to basically use AI for everything and to say it bluntly, dumb down, right?
Yeah.
But in the US or in the Western world, for that matter, we haven't arrived at that point yet because it's still, the honeymoon phase, for lack of a better word.
It's too new.
Right? It's too new. Yeah. Hey, Chris, thanks again. It was really great having
Alexander.
you, and I hope we can have you on next season again.
Today's podcast is brought to you by AI-Spurg. In just 5 minutes, AI-Spurg becomes a guardian agent that oversees all AI traffic, enforces policies, and protects your enterprise from AI breach. Learn more at aispurg.ai.